So talking about Netflix, I you know I actually grew up in South America, and growing in South America, no one knew about K content, right? I used to go to school and I would bring like Korean food, and it always I think it was like worse than Korean Americans because like no one knew like my South American friends didn't even know where Korea was, right? But I go back to Colombia this year, and all my my friends who I grew up not knowing anything about Korea, they're like, "Oh, I love that Woo lawyer, that like that autistic lawyer TV content," and everyone was just like telling me about like how they loved X content, Y content of like all these like Korean TV shows in Netflix. And it was like so surprising because like, oh, since when all these like Latinos are watching K content? So I think it's not only in the States or primarily like English speaking countries, it's like worldwide.
Welcome to the K Content Podcast, a limited series podcast that reviews the modern history of the rise of Korean content. Whether you watch K content or not, everyone kind of knows that it's big and it's growing. So, putting some specific numbers onto this, the total export value of K content is 12.45 billion in 2021, uh, and that exceeded home appliances sales, which was 8.67 billion, electric cars, which is 6.99 billion, and also display panels, which was 3.6 billion. I'm John. I'm not good with coming up with podcast titles, but I do make good content for a living, if I do say so myself. Primarily games for gaming studios like Riot Games or big tech firms like Amazon and Meta. I've also dabbled a little bit with kids' TV shows for a few years at Amazon Kids. I got interested in making this podcast because I'm a big consumer of Korean content, especially Netflix shows, of which I think I watched over 20 seasons this year alone. I just wrapped up Singles Inferno 3. I may have shed a tear. It's embarrassing. That's what my girlfriend tells me. I am joined by my co host, Minchi, who I met at a Samsung Web3 meetup a few years ago. And Minchi was also my team's guide in Korea during a business trip last year. Welcome, Minchi.
Hi everyone, Vinci here. Excited to be here, John. And it's quite funny that you actually shed a tear in Singles Inferno. I generally love researching, developing market thesis, and just understanding where disruptive innovation meets markets. So I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about the ins and outs of K content. I've been in the tech space for the past 9 years. I've worn multiple hats, whether that it's an early stage investor of 500 startups. I was also doing BD in an early stage SaaS startup that got acquired by a Japanese conglomerate. And I also did some corporate innovation for a big telco in South Korea. Back to you, John.
So you mentioned that you liked analyzing things, and
Yeah.
one recent example that I saw was you published a 69 slide deck specifically on Korean Web3 games. And I really appreciate and respect the level of depth you go into what some people may consider a niche area. And I think a lot of people who want to understand Korean content may consider that a niche area as well. We'll add your link we'll add the link to your deck in the show notes as well. And let's get started. Tell us about like maybe the history of the rise of Korean content.
Thank you so much for the humble brag on my 69 slide deck. It will be worth it, guys. I assure you that. So, going back to Korean content, it's not a new phenomenon. This has been happening for decades now. There's even a word for it. It's called Hallyu, which literally means Korean wave. It is a collective term used to describe the growth and popularity of Korea's popular culture worldwide. This includes music, movies, TV drama, online games, and food. Based on the exponential success that we've been seeing in Korean culture, it feels like the scale of Korean culture exportation cannot even be contained by this single word. This is why John and I we decided to launch this podcast to deep dive into what constitutes K culture, the building blocks to reach this massive scale, and I think most importantly where we're headed.
Great. Well, This is episode one, and in this episode, we're going to cover a broad overview of the content types, the players who are making the content. We're going to reference a lot of Korean names. I am not Korean, so I will not be able to say the names 100% correctly, but I say that out of respect so that people know that I'm not purposely screwing it up. So let's get started. Like many trends, it's hard to pinpoint an exact starting point. One legendary story starts in 1994. South Korea's then president, Kim Young-sam, read a report that the export revenue of Jurassic Park, which was $1 billion in revenue off of a $63 million budget for the movie, had matched that of the export revenue of 1.5 million Hyundai cars. The Korean government started to earmark around 1% of their national budget on subsidies and low interest loans to cultural industries, launching agencies to promote and expand K-pop artists, launching agencies to promote and expand K-pop exports, and setting up more cultural departments at universities. In 1998, the new South Korean president, Kim Dae-jung, said in his inaugural speech, quote, "We must pour our energy into globalizing Korean culture as a way to get past the crisis of the 1997 IMF loan," which I know you'll talk about later. And the later part of his quote says, quote, "We must embrace and develop the high values contained in traditional culture. The culture industry is one of the basic industries of the 21st century. Tourism, the convention industry, the visual industry, and the special cultural commodities are a treasure trove for which a limitless market is waiting."
And interestingly, John, after President Kim Young-sam talked about the Jurassic Park and to Hyundai car comparison, whenever we have great success achieved in the culture industry in Korea, the economic effect of that specific cultural content produced is expressed in the number of Hyundai cars sold or the gross car sales revenue, which is a very interesting and crazy like comparison that we do. So, for example, in 1999, there was a very popular movie called Shiri, and it attracted 6 million viewers. That was big back then, and earned 36 billion Korean won in office revenue. The Bank of Korea actually compared that economic effect, which was like estimated to 110.7 billion Korean won, and that was compared to the production of 3,119 EF Hyundai Sonatas. And I checked a recent news article recently, and we still do that. That's really funny. I think we're the only country that actually compares cultural economic effect to Hyundai cars, and obviously we're very proud of our Hyundai and Kia cars.
And last night I was thinking about this comment that you made, and I think a big part of it is because uh, historically the South Korean economy was dependent on manufacturing. Could be hardware, it could be goods like cars and things like that. So it's a relic of the past to compare kind of now, which is more software based economy. So, kind of putting on my military hat, I think that the success of K content is actually a great representation of soft power, the ability to persuade others to do what one wishes without force or coercion. I really nerded out about these stats. So, amongst Americans, South Korea's favorability rating is now 60 on a 0 to 100 scale. That's the highest ever recorded um, by the Chicago Council. And it's kind of like a two-way street. It's really like a love fest between the U.S. and South Korea at the moment. So according to the Pew Center, 89% of South Koreans hold a favorable view of America. And just last year, the South Korean president delivered a speech to a joint session of Congress celebrating the 70th year of our alliance. And both Democrats and Republicans applauded. And there's not a lot of things that both Democrats and Republicans applaud today, unfortunately. Um, so let's get back to the story about the IMF loan because I mentioned it earlier. Could you describe that a bit?
Right. So, in Korea, if you say IMF loan, I think everyone knows, even the Gen Z uh, of today. But just so just so we talk about it and understand the significance of it, I need to like say that the IMF, we call it the IMF financial crisis, but generally in Asia we just call it financial crisis of 1997. So what caused it? Specifically in Korea, there were chaebol companies, which I'll be mentioning later. They were debt choked, poorly managed, and they triggered an entire nationwide bank crisis. And the Bank of Korea was very low in foreign reserves. So feared foreign investors and also domestic investors started dumping all these stocks, and they started amassing dollars because they thought that the Korean won was going to fail. And obviously, this further depressed the Korean won. In a matter of months, not even like a year, 11 chaebol companies collapsed in 1997, which is huge, and 10 more out of the 50 plus chaebol companies were at risk of bankruptcy. Uh, if to give you some context of what this actually means, the mass collapse of conglomerates actually costed Korea 100 billion USD, which back then it accounted for 20% of the entire economy. So the IMF loan was actually the last resort of the Korean government to inject emergency foreign reserves into the economy, basically US dollars. Hence why the financial crisis in Korea, it's actually called the IMF crisis rather than just calling it the financial crisis of 1997.
Now is a good time to bring up the government because I think the Korean government plays a very interesting role, not only in Korean society, but also Korean content. So, from the Korean content perspective, in 2023, it earmarked 652 million US dollars to invest in K content. A couple of examples of how the money was spent. I'm using Korean wons now. 1 billion Korean wons uh, was allocated to train artists who can draw webtoons that can hopefully attract 1 billion views or more. And also a billion Korean won to build an esports stadium, which we'll cover in our gaming and esports episode in the future.
And how's the traction on the user side?
So there's just so much different content types. It's hard to aggregate it into a single number, but we're going to use Netflix TV series a lot in this podcast because Netflix has graciously published a lot of data. And in 2022 and 2023, in January, they published, hey, here's all the content we've made and who made it and what. A popular data point that was popularized was that 60% of all Netflix members worldwide watched Korean titles in 2022. And 3 of Netflix's most watched shows are from Korea. Personal anecdote, I find 2 to 3 of the top 10 shows on Netflix are Korean at any given week. Last year, Netflix ordered their largest slate of Korean content, which equates to 21 TV shows, 6 films, and 7 reality slash variety shows, including Singles Inferno 3.
The one that John
The one
cried,
I really,
guys.
the one I really care about.
So talking about Netflix, I, I actually grew up in South America, and growing in South America, no one knew about K content, right? I used to go to school and I would bring like Korean food, and always I think it was like worse than Korean Americans because like no one knew, like my South American friends didn't even know where Korea was, right? But I go back to Colombia this year, and all my like my friends who I grew up not knowing anything about Korea, they're like, "Oh, I loved that Woo Young-woo lawyer, that like that autistic lawyer TV content," and everyone was just like telling me about like how they loved X content, Y content of like all these like Korean TV shows in Netflix. And it was like so surprising because like, oh, since when all these like Latinos are watching K content? So I think it's not only in the States or primarily like English speaking countries, it's like worldwide. And I just wanted to highlight that. But talking about content, I think we should also talk about movies, John, where uh, I mean, when we talk about movies, we do have to mention what Parasite achieved in terms of numbers and in terms of achievements. So it was actually directed by a very acclaimed director in Korea called Bong Joon-ho. And he became the first non-English language film. That movie became the first non-English language film to win the Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and the first Korean film to win the Palme d'Or in 2019. 3 years later, another Korean director, super famous as well, called Park Chan-wook, became the first Korean director to win the Cannes Best Director Award for his film Decision to Leave. We've never achieved these numbers. We've never achieved these accomplishments. And I think that actually triggered the start because we're going to see more content achieving these awards. So, and then now that we talked about TV series, movies, if we move on to Korean music, we need to highlight the very famous Gangnam Style by Psy that was launched in 2012, which we should agree that it helped pave the way for K-pop's global ascent. And today, bands like BTS, Blackpink, who became the first K-pop band to headline Coachella, are well known globally. You can hear their music, which includes Korean words, all over the U.S. radio, and I think being played on the U.S. radio is a sign of popularity in the music scene here in the States.
You're totally spot on. Just on the radio point, yesterday I had lunch with the music executive, and he was saying getting new artists on the radio in the U.S. is still a big deal. People still listen to the radio. People still drive their cars and commute to work. So that's very interesting. And I have a confession to make, and my confession is that I primarily listen to Spotify, and in my Spotify Wrapped of this year, I have the Spotify Wrapped of a teenage Korean girl. So my top five artists are New Jeans, IU Twice, and I don't even know what number 4 or 5 is. I think they're just probably artists who primarily sing songs from like Korean TV shows that I liked, and I put it on repeat. But obviously, New Jeans was widely acknowledged as the hottest new K-pop band of last year. I think they technically been out for 2 years.
I think it's teenage Korean boy because all of your top artists are actually female artists.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Okay. Moving on to games. The most famous Korean game is PUBG, or otherwise known as Player Unknown Battlegrounds. And that game has the rare distinction of being a game that had over 100 million monthly active users during its peak. It also spawned a whole new genre of game style called Battle Royale, which basically is what Fortnite became. There's also different Call of Duty modes. PUBG got so popular that it was banned in India. um, so there are only a few games that has ever joined the so-called 100 million monthly active users club, or MAU club, and they're primarily from the U.S., like Fortnite, which is Battle Royale, and now it has more of a UGC component. League of Legends, from Riot Games, that's also U.S. based. Roblox is more of a platform, but it's also U.S. based, and Minecraft as well. It's now owned by Microsoft, but it originated from Sweden. So PUBG, it was made by Bluehole, which changed its name to Krafton, and they got listed. And I believe it was one of the largest IPOs on the Kospi when it IPO'd. Um, there seems to be like a new generation of Korean developers coming out. The most notable one is called Iron Mace. They've been making a lot of noise with their up and coming game called Dark and Darker, which peaked at 100,000 concurrent players, becoming a top 10 game on Steam, even during its alpha. It also has been making a lot of noise because there has been a lawsuit with Nexon, which we'll cover in the gaming episode. Nexon is one of the top Korean developers, publicly traded, and it claimed that Iron Mace, which had former Nexon employees, stole intellectual property from Nexon. And then the game has been off Steam since then. But I'm keeping my eye out for Iron Mace. So now that we've described the success of K content, let's start talking about the companies making this content. And many of these are quote unquote entertainment companies. But what does the common Korean citizen when they think of the word entertainment?
So it's actually funny because as a Korean, I thought everywhere in the world called this whole segment entertainment, but I've realized, creating this podcast, like when people say entertainment South Korea, we actually mean two things. The first thing is describing the music labels, the agencies. So we have YG, who produced Big Bang, Blackpink, SM, Girls' Generation, aespa, Hybe, the famous BTS, New Jeans, JYP, entertainment company behind Twice, ITZY, Stray Kids, 17. We're gonna cover all these entertainment companies, by the way. But when we say entertainment, we also mean conglomerates such as CJENM, Rising Kakao Entertainment, and all these like conglomerates, like bigger companies who are making TV shows, films, and music. Again, we're going to cover all these ecosystem players in the upcoming episodes, specifically talking about the music side and the content production side. And we will also plan to cover other content types like webtoons and, as John mentioned, the game side. So just to understand how big they are, I want to we went and researched the market cap to give you guys some reference point. So Hybe, the entertainment company behind New Jeans and BTS, they have a market cap of 8 billion USD. JYP is 2.8 billion, SM is 1.7 billion, and YG is the smallest with 651 million. CJ E&M, the content production arm of the CJ Group, has a market cap of 1.1 billion USD, and Kakao Entertainment is to be worth approximately 11 to 12 trillion Korean won, which is approximately 8.3 billion USD. And Kakao Entertainment, we're gonna go deeply and like a more detailed overview of it, but it's hard to like pinpoint like which components are specifically for music and which components are specifically for the SM side and so on. But we're gonna try to like give you guys a breakthrough thread and understand why they have a big market cap of 8.3 billion. So um, again, the Kakao, and there's like two big tech firms in Korea, Kakao and Naver, and we have to mention these two big tech firms because they're also deeply immersed in the content and like music production side. And just to give you guys a reference of their market caps, Kakao is 18.9 billion, Naver is 27 billion. But again, we'll come back to all these numbers and all these like players. It's a little bit confusing because there are so many names and so many numbers, but we're gonna understand like which companies are in which entertainment buckets so that we can have a better understanding, a better comparison we can do within these like companies.
And the reason we go into these numbers is to show the relative size for a Western audience who may not know about it. Because to some degree, we're like, okay, a music agency is worth 1 billion, but like,
What does it mean?
but their impact seems so big because it's always like in the media, but it's quote unquote just a $1 billion company. For comparison, we're looking at end of year 2023 market cap. Disney was around 166 billion and Netflix was 208 billion. I specifically mentioned these two companies because they're really at the center of one of the major stories in US entertainment, which is the streaming wars. And when I was at Amazon from 2017 to 2021, we were buying a lot of content. And to be frank, the best ones usually end up at Netflix, not only because they had the biggest distribution, they still pay the most. By 2023, most institutional investors realized that streaming is essentially a quote consumer surplus race to the bottom type business. I got that quote from Chamath. I think that's it, that sentiment is reflected in the stock prices, primarily of Disney, of Warner Brothers, etc. So, given the whole streaming war story in the US, I was wondering, is there a quote unquote big story or macro narrative or trend that's happening in Korean media and entertainment?
So I think the story in Korea is more complicated than that. And there are three major points that we can highlight here. First, South Korea represents one of the most competitive and exciting streaming markets. Um, there's like a wealthy middle class population of 52 million. From a US perspective, American companies are born to go global from day one, I would say so, right? So that's why we have like Disney and like Netflix with like enormous like market caps. But however, for Korean companies to go global, they first need to compete and win the domestic market. This is the same for startups, by the way, which is
Hmm.
hard when the likes of Netflix and Disney are already the battle ring, right? So furthermore, like Korean native OTT streamers, like most Korean companies, want to expand globally, and this is even more complicated because again, as you said, with like the whole like Amazon, when you were in Amazon, all the best contents were going to Netflix. It's the same thing with Korean content. They will actually prefer to get licensed by global streamers like Netflix and Disney rather than going to a local OTT streamer. So this competitive dynamic has led to a lot of consolidation in the local streaming market, which is why the rumor that CJEN's majority-owned TVing and SK Telecoms, which is the telco that I worked for, majority-owned WAV, which is the Hulu of Korea, are merging. That news is not surprising for Korea, and a lot of consolidation is happening due to the pressure internally and externally. So the second point that I would say is that K-pop companies are finding great success expanding overseas, as we've mentioned, and especially in the U.S. market. They also export the K-pop model to create locally grown artists in other non-Korean markets. And an example is a, a, a group called An Team, and that is locally produced in the Japanese market. The third point is that K. Another point that I want to mention is that K-pop companies are starting to find success from their community monetization platforms, and the famous example case study for this is Hybe's Weavers, and that's why Hybe seems to be leading all fronts in this specific strategic play. And the last point is that due to the complex nature of Korean companies, which I'll be talking about, the Chaebols power conglomerates and all these like networked um, uh, entities within a single holding company. There's also like the tech companies expanding into entertainment. And the whole idea, a very like common practice, business practice in Korea is like companies mixing blood, which is essentially they just like investing in each other. There's a lot of strategic impacts to whatever chess move one single company does, right? So again, going back to your question, John, where is there like a macro narrative, a very simple macro narrative as a race to the bottom, a streaming war kind of stuff? It is more complicated than that, and I will try my best to actually dissect all these three points that I've mentioned.
So let's talk about Chaebols because I've been hearing about them ever since I was a U.S. Army officer stationed in South Korea. And I don't know if this is a Korean thing or an Asian thing, but there's always a lot of attention placed on wealth. And therefore, wealthy families are the center of a lot of like media and attention. And now that I'm a cake content stan slash fan, um, I've even watched a couple of TV shows centered around Chaebols. So could you explain what these are, since we've mentioned this a couple times?
Right, again, so you know how Hallyu literally meant Korean wave,
Hmm.
wave? Daewol literally means Che is stands for wealth and Pol is clan. So if you take that literal translation, it means close knit families running these like enormous companies, right? So Chaebols, when we say Chaebol in Korea, we mean like all the conglomerates run by these specific families. So we have the Chung family for Hyundai. We have the Lee family for Samsung. We have the Koo family for LG and the Tres for SK, Sheins of Lotte, and we can go on because there's like
Hmm.
almost like 30 to 50 like tablet companies in Korea. So just some history of where the tables came from. The rise of Chaebols actually dates back to post-Korea War of 1953, when we had military dictators back then, and these dictators started anointing a handful of families, or like the male leader of those like families, for special loans, like basically zero interest loans, and financial support to rebuild the economy. The formation of chaebols is said to be influenced by Japan's zaibatsu, which are family-owned conglomerates still present in the Japanese economy, by the way. But the biggest difference between zaibatsu concept and chaebols is that in zaibatsu, family is referred more like a close clan, and they don't have to be blood relatives. Whereas in Korean chaebols, blood ties is what matters, and blood is always thicker than water. And there's so much drama regarding that. Hence, why you see so much Korean TV dramas and movies like covering that family feud and etc.
Can you told me recently about this like a big Japanese company or a famous Japanese company that like adopted like
Oh,
someone adopted a
Korean
son.
company.
Oh, it's a Korean company?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I was telling John that the Koo family had the previous chairman of the Koo family had a son, but the son died when he was a teenager, I think. So they decided to adopt their nephew, but he was obviously not the first, like the one who was supposed to inherit the entire LG family. The LG family has always adopted this, you know, this very antiquated, family tradition where the first son of the first son will be inheriting the entire like company. So they decided to adopt this nephew, and the nephew has always been like the next in line after this chairman. The chairman did die, and they thought that okay, like he's gonna lead the entire LG group. But what happened was now the daughters of the former chairman and the wife of the former chairman had went through like this entire legal battle with the current adopted son slash like leader of LG, because they think that he partnered up, like he was actually amassing all these votes internally with like the board and like all these shareholders to kind of steal shares out of and control out of the daughters and the former wife. But it was complicated because the former chairman, before dying, he actually didn't write a very detailed a will to say how much shares will be allocated to the daughters, to the adopted son, etc. And everything was assumed. So it's quite sad, and there's like a lot of like news articles, like they have this like image of like the daughters and the mom like kind of like hugging each other and like going into like sorrow moments when like the adopted son is like getting all the spotlight, which kind of sucks because like the daughter should have been in power, in my opinion.
This actually sounds like the plot of Succession.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so which I think is loosely based on the Murdochs. So I think this happens everywhere in the world. But going back to Chebos, I think we have this in America too. We had the Rockefellers, we had the Carnegies, we had the Vanderbilts, and the difference is that these American, wealthy families, and then I think the pejorative term is people call them the robber barons. The, the these families and their companies were really broken up by the U.S. government instead of being kind of aided by the government in the case of South Korea. And even today, we always hear about, the Sherman Antitrust Act, especially given the power of big tech firms these days in the U.S. So, in the U.S., it seems like we have a law to break up the monopolies. They were used successfully back then. This law has not been really used recently here in the U.S. So I just wanted to give a quick U.S. perspective.
Right. To elaborate more on the birth of all these Chaebol families, I need to explain how important was the patronage of political leaders and the support of like the political like the governors, like senators, like presidents, and etc. for all these like Chaebol companies. So there has always been this like strong tie between like the political leader and the anointed uh, Chaebol families. And under the regimen of president, some people say dictator Park Chung-hee, who came to power in a coup and was in power for 2 decades in Korea. He strongly deemed Chaebol-owned companies as an instrumental part of his ambitions to industrialize South Korea. And I was telling you, John, that back then when the World Bank was like creating like these reports for Asia, Southeast Asia, and etc. They said when Korea was talking with the World Bank and they say, "Oh, we would like to start manufacturing cars." The World Bank said like, "No, there's no way. You guys don't have the infrastructure. You don't know how to like build cars." And there's like there's a say like people say that Park Chung-hee got kind of pissed by this report and he started like giving tons of funding to this specific anointed family, which happens to be the ones that founded Hyundai Motors. And Hyundai Motors was born in 1967, which was basically a couple of years after the World Bank report came out saying South Korea does not have the resources to start manufacturing cars. So this is a clear example how you need to be blessed by the political leader and how these tablet companies started their empires by the blessing of the government.
So I did some digging while you were just talking about Chaebol families, and what's very interesting to me is essentially we're talking about family owned businesses, and I was just looking at Wikipedia, but 7 of the top 10 family owned businesses are actually American. I think only one is Korean, but that could be more about like the market size of America versus Korea. But you kind of get the point. um, there still are business dynasties with all these family ties in America as well. Actually, Walmart, and the current chairman of Walmart's board of directors is Greg Penner, who I'm sure is competent and accomplished is who I'm sure is competent and accomplished in his own right. He also happens to have married the granddaughter of Sam Walton, who was the founder of Walmart. So I found that to be quite interesting. And we're talking about Chaebols a lot because we're about to jump into a section to explain the key studios making these TV series in production, and they happen to be owned by Chaebols. And once again, going back to Netflix because they have a lot of data that they publish, 55% of Netflix's Korean TV slate, the original slate from 2022 to 2023, were produced by two studios, Studio Dragon and SLL. Could you talk a little bit about them and then their kind of parent companies?
So we actually didn't notice, John, when we started
Right,
like
right. That's
researching, and
true.
we're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like even in the entertainment business, it's like the Chaebol's power is there, right?
Right,
So,
right, right.
so the parent company that we're talking about here is CJ Group, and their most well known entertainment division is CJ E&M, which Studio Dragon is was part of, and they decided to spun off from CJ E&M. And but then we will reference it as CJ&M just for the intro section of it, for the sake of like ease. Now, zooming out to a higher level, CJ Group. I need to give you some context since we were talking about the whole like dynamic of Chaebols. Is that the parent company itself has wide-ranging businesses from food, bio, logistics slash shipment, beauty shops, Olive Young. If you have been to Korea, like that's the equivalent of Sephora, and that's where everyone ends up going if they go like traveling to Seoul in South Korea. And then what we also need to note is that CJ actually began as a sugar and flour manufacturing company within the Samsung Corporation. So again, it's like two Chaebol family. It's like a sub Chaebol family, I would say. Samsung, CJ, and then we have all these like verticals now. CJ literally stands for, in Korean, is 제일제당. 제일 means first. 제당 means sugar manufacturer. So when people hear CJ, they would have never imagined that it was like the first sugar manufacturing company in Korea. For me, I think that's why CJ going into the F&B vertical and being so strong in the F&B vertical, it's not surprising because the deep roots, their historical roots of CJ actually comes from F&B. And I think it's like deeply rooted in their DNA. And talking about the CJ's food business, their bibigo dumplings recorded a whooping 930 million in sales in 2020. And I'm pretty sure it's like way higher if we look at 21, 22, 23 sales, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of dumplings. Two comments. First, as a long-term LA resident, I was surprised to see the BBQ logo on LeBron James jersey.
We would have never thought that would
Yeah, because I've seen it
happen.
on like TV shows because they always like do this like
Right.
native advertising. But I was surprised to see that they were on his jersey. But it makes sense because there's probably a huge local Korean American population in SoCal. But the second comment is this is one of those surprising things that we're still digging into, which is there's lots of, for lack of a better word, incestuous investments across all these chaebols and tech companies and just Korean companies in general. You know, the US corporate structure seems a lot more clean. So when you think about like Facebook, or I'm sorry, Meta or Amazon, they own all their quote unquote subsidiaries. It's not really a thing to think about like, oh, Amazon will spin off Prime Video and own 50% of that. But as we get into the Naver and Kakao episode, we'll see that they actually,
Which are the two big
the
techs.
two big tech companies in Korea, they spun out a lot of their subsidiaries and they own parts of it. So it's kind of interesting why, and I don't think we've got down to the root cause of why they do that just yet. So, so you talked a lot about food and CJ. So back over to you about, hey, how does CJ kind of like go from sugar to food to like media?
So since media is our destination, we need to understand like how they first expanded into media, and they went through this process of first launching the home shopping business, which is still very big. It's called the CJO shopping. My grandmother actually does a lot of the shopping through CJO shopping, by the way. And then they started expanding to TV networks, movie production, music management, games, streaming services. And again, I need to remind everyone that they start as a sugar manufacturing company, right? And then what CJ Group is doing ultimate, doing, I think it reminds us a lot what the Disney synergy is, which is like everything is synergistic to the main businesses of Disney. And CJ created this distribution channel for every content type, right? So we have the music component, the movie component. And just to give you some examples of it, like they will produce a TV drama, a variety TV show for its TVN network, which is their TV network. And then they will have their music show, which is called Mnet. They also have like Mnet Awards, which is like a huge thing as well. They also have the movie component of it called OCN. And then all these like moving parts within CJ are synergistic to each other. Uh, Looking at the music component, they will organize this like massive concerts such as Mama and KCON, and it will be broadcasted in Mnet again. And then while the movies they produce will be shown on OCN, and they also have a movie theater line called CGV. So then again, like all of this will be like helping, all the businesses will be helping each other through a very beautiful synergy within the CJ umbrella.
So, this model and some of these numbers that we've talked about so far reminds me of tech firms, kind of specifically Amazon when we think about, the 930 million in dumpling sales versus this, 1.1 billion market cap entertainment division. It sounds like, Amazon's retail sales are funding a lot of the content creation. And the flywheel is if you have Amazon Prime, you get to watch the shows and maybe you'll end up shopping more because you already pay for Amazon Prime. So that's kind of like when I think about CJENM and CJ Group, it reminds me of that model. So now that we've covered CJ a lot, let's talk about the other big player, which I know a lot less about. It's really about SLL, but their parent company is called Content Tree Jungang. So it's complicated as well. So why don't you cover that?
So just like the CJENM and Studio Dragon relationship, there's an important relationship here that we have to mention in the content side, which is Content Tree Chungang and SLL relationship. Both Content Tree Chungang and SLL are subsidiaries of a bigger group, another Chaebol group called Chungang Group. The origin story of this media conglomerate dates back to 1963 when the founder of Samsung Group, the founder of the entire Samsung dynasty, actually, his name is Lee Byung-chul, founded 중앙일보, which again literally means Central Daily in Korean. It is still one of the top, most important and top three newspapers in Korea. And in 1999, Chungang spun off from the umbrella of the Samsung Group, and that's how the Chungang dynasty started without being under the Samsung Group, right? And it became an independent company. So from a zoom out perspective, if you think about it, because CJ also comes from the roots of Samsung, and because and Chungang was also founded by the founder of Samsung, they are kind of distant cousins, and they're all related, somehow related to the Lee founding family of Samsung, which is why, to be honest, like there are some litigations and like family feud between the CJ and the Chungang group, because when the founder of Samsung died, there was again some complications of who gets which media asset. Now moving on to SLL, the acronym is Studio Lululala. I think it's pretty cute.
Yeah.
Was formerly known as JTBC Studios, by the way. And it's a subsidiary of JTBC TV Broadcasting. JTBC is all, again, part of the Chungang Group. And they're the ones that produces the K dramas and also acts as a talent management company. There are outstandingly 15 different multimedia, TV, and film production studios under this whole entire umbrella, including Drama House Studio, BA Entertainment. And under SLL, they have been creating over 300 different kinds of content and drama, films, and variety shows. In April 2022, quite recently, it announced that it will be investing 2.4 billion USD in new content over the next 5 years to produce 30 TV series, 5 films, and more. And then SLL is also setting up a producing business in Japan to leverage the many potential Japanese IPs, which is basically taking the playbook that they've succeeded in Korea and going to Japan, and use and ship content with the Japanese content to global OTTs, right? So, and interestingly, all these growth and all these initiatives are closely scrutinized by the financial market because they've been announcing that they're preparing for an IPO either in Seoul or in another market in the latter half of this year. With the raised capital after going public, SLL will aim to more than double the company's sales to around 2 trillion Korean won in 2000 by 2025, and be producing 40 to 50 TV shows per year. Per year, like how many more content are you gonna watch on Netflix now, John?
So you bring up a good point, actually, which is, this podcast is about why Korean content is doing so well, and we're gonna dig into that. But there's only episode one. But one theory I'm starting to build is that maybe by the time we get to episode 8, we'll come to this conclusion. We might be in an era of peak K content. I know for sure we're in peak games because that's the industry I'm in. And it's widely acknowledged in the gaming industry that there are more games available, the number of hours that players have to even play good games. So you end up having a big backlog. And the competition is so fierce. Same thing. Like I watch roughly 20 Korean shows on Netflix this year. Each show is 16 episodes, roughly an hour. I just don't have time to watch anything else. Maybe I'll watch some other shows produced by other countries or other studios, but K content alone, I think I've reached my personal peak like there's just I can't watch more shows. I've got games, books. We consume all sorts of content. But one other funny point is now that you've mentioned like Central Daily, First Sugar, Korean Wave, I don't feel bad about the podcast title being K content. Okay, so now that we've covered some of the major players in primarily TV series or streaming show production, who we have dubbed, as representatives of kind of like legacy media, um, let's give a quick overview of K-pop. And what I'm about to say is really referencing a narrative that I found from a report that you sent to me from Mirae Asset Securities, which is the largest investment bank in South Korea. So, they have a theory, which I agree with, that K-pop expansion overseas has three phases. And also K-pop overseas expansion is the main strategy. So, quick history is BTS single-handedly carried out K-pop expansion overseas from 2018 to 2021. Then they announced their hiatus in 2022, and I think they have like their own. They joined the Korean military, which I think has mandatory 2-year service, and then they also spun off as they kind of like staggered their joining of the military, so certain artists can have their own kind of like personal solo careers. 2023 is when things ramped up. I think all the label stocks went up a bit. And then this report suggests that 2024 is going to be a banner year. So what are the three phases of this overseas expansion? So first phase is just increase artist activities in overseas markets. So that means, host more concerts, sell more albums, stream more music. And I think all this really happened. And the target markets are US, since it's so big, South America, and also Europe. That's kind of obvious. The next two are kind of more interesting. So second, there's this concept of exporting the K-pop model itself. So that's developing non-Korean idol groups, but they could have Korean members, but they're managed by Korean entertainment companies. Some of these new groups have made progress. There's once again, I'm a boomer, so I can't pronounce some of these names. It could be Nizu from JYP or An Team from Hybe, and NCT, new team from SM.
Is it a new team? So it's different to NCT?
I don't know, but that's why I found the report, and they found streaming success in Japan, and they're planning concert tours in 2024. And their success last year raised the expectations of upcoming debuts of these quote unquote local bands like Vicha. Is it Vicha? Do you know? It's JYP and Cat's Eye. I hope it's Cat's Eye from Hybe. And as I mentioned, I had lunch with a music executive yesterday, and he mentioned that the K-pop model is very attractive because in the US there's so much fragmentation of like managers, like agents, and there's like 5 or 6 people involved. It's so hard to get anything done. So the Korean model is just more clean. Now it's not super artist friendly, I gotta say, but maybe we can meet in the middle ground. If the US is just kind of like the Wild Wild West, like any relationships go, the Korean model is like 100% like label. I think things are evolving to kind of meet somewhere in the middle. And then the third phase, which is also something new to me but I find kind of interesting, is this report claims that it's social media strategies and community monetization and management platforms. Now, the social media part, I'm not too hot about as a strategy. Like anyone can like copy or use social media in a quote unquote good or authentic way. But I do think this community monetization / management platform that you mentioned earlier, like Hybe's Weavers, is kind of exciting because I haven't seen a US equivalent of that. And they do expect, this report, this investment bank expects even US artists to jump onto
Oh wow.
Weavers.
Okay.
And if that's the case, I find it to be pretty interesting.
Um Yeah, so could you give us like a little bit of more understanding of Hybe, SM?
Sure. So yeah, I'm focused more just for this intro episode on Hybe and SM because they're the biggest by market cap,
Mm-hmm.
and they seem to have the most momentum, and they represent kind of the old versus the new, but it's more nuanced. So as I mentioned earlier, K-pop overseas was largely a BTS thing from 2018 to 2021, riding off the massive success of BTS. And they could sign other artists, they bought other businesses, they expanded to other countries. They really like enhanced their lead. And then when Hybe went public in 2020, so I guess they raised more capital to enhance everything else I just said they're gonna do. So if Hybe represents the new, then SM kind of represents the old, but not necessarily in a bad way. So SM was founded by Lee Sun-man, a legendary music producer who is widely referred to in South Korea as "quote unquote" the godfather of K-pop for introducing this genre to a mass audience. And also, as a reference of like kind of like new versus old, the average tenure of the SM artists is 12 years. Now, some of the good things, like SM has done very well in Japan. I think even compared to most of its peers, including Hybe. And Japan is really, once the Korean market is saturated, I think Japan is really a natural next step for Korean companies, including China. And I also want to mention SM in this episode one because, well, SM was in the center of this big kind of drama between Hybe and Kakao, who was fighting to acquire a large chunk of SM. So ultimately, Kakao won. They increased their stake from 4.9% to 39.9% for 963 million US dollars. And at the time, the Kakao CEO said that the companies would combine the strengths of Kakao, tech expertise, quote unquote, and SM's IP and production skills to expand their collective growth. And I think this is a great segue into like a quick overview of the tech companies because they're starting to compete in these in multiple entertainment verticals like TV series production. I mentioned SSL and Studio Dragon, but in the Netflix tracker that I made, Kakao has a couple of shows they produce too. Not a lot. I think it was like two per year, but you can see that they're starting to ramp up. And also, uh, given the nature of how these companies own subsidiaries and whatnot, that number could be higher because who really knows which who owns what? We have to probably do the math again on that. So let's. You mentioned Kakao, Naver, top two companies. Naver's bigger. Let's talk about Naver first.
Sure. Naver is like the Google of Korea. But whereas Google is primarily search and is search when you go into the landing page, Naver is a search plus web portal. And John, I was like trying to explain you like the difference of it. And you're like, wait, I don't understand. Like, how can it be search plus web portal? And then if you literally type in naver.com, you can see that it's more like Yahoo than Google. It's more complicated. We like to see everything at one glance: the news component, the email, the shopping, etc. And to give you some context, like Naver was born in 1999, and this is deemed like the start of the tech boom in Korea. And just to give you more historical context, is this is when the Korean government decided to lay all the high-speed internet infrastructure. That's why it's deemed as like the start of the tech boom. And it started as a small startup that obviously successfully transitioned to one of the top companies in Korea in terms of market cap. And they're actually ranked number 9 in Kospi, which is the equivalent of S&P 500 in the Korean market. So Naver generated 6.5 billion of revenue and 45% coming from search, display, and advertisement, obviously. They also do commerce, and 22% of their revenue came from commerce. They also have fintech. 15% came from of the revenue came from that segment, and 15% of their revenue came from content last year. And we're gonna talk about what they mean by content from the neighbor's perspective.
And I'm glad you mentioned that Korean high speed internet investment because that's going to be a big theme on the gaming episode as well. Because what has really impressed me so far is that well, government and the industry can work together. And in this case, it's just unanimously positive that the government invested so much in high speed internet. It led to the boom of these internet companies plus gaming companies. And I guess I'm just so surprised by it because I know, like, me being here in the US, there's lots of dysfunction in government. So like hearing governments do super well, you're like, whoa, that's like, let's talk about that. Um,
And that's like a recurring theme in our podcast where the content side started with like Kim Young-sam,
exactly.
like content, music, game, high-speed internet. And then I think it's because it comes from the playbook of Chaebols.
I see. I see.
It's like
That's very
that's the root
interesting.
of
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
So
so
that's kind of like a positive angle to the Chaebols, which is, even though K content is at its peak right now, the government's still investing in it. It's not done yet, and I find that to be pretty cool. So, I was really fascinated with this whole Yahoo part, and then you also mentioned that a lot of the search results are blogs. Because one big theme on this podcast, I've already started to know this, is this concept of UGC. Like webtoons is UGC, the webtoons lead to TV shows. I mean, we've historically used UGC in the West to really apply to like video content like YouTube, and now obviously recently TikTok. It's also huge in games. So obviously in my world, it's like Roblox, it's like Fortnite, and so on. So I feel like the Korean companies, culture, people are really big on UGC writing, whether it's blogs or later on we're gonna talk about webtoons and these like serialized novels, which is fascinating because I think US, if not, I think it's the biggest or like one of the top uh, reader countries in the world. And like, we'll dig into it later, but like, how come serialized content for, written content hasn't really taken off in the US just yet? There's some signals, of course. But people just read a lot of books in the US, which is great. So yeah, tell us more about this kind of like UGC blogging because this is, I think it started a lot off in Korea.
I I think it's funny because like I think Koreans started doing UGC without before a term was even created.
Hmm.
Right? And from its early days, from inception, UGC was the heart of Naver. And you can see it by which features they start launching from their early days. And there's a service called Knowledge N, which is basically kind of like the Quora or the Yahoo answer service. And funny, this knowledge N service was actually launched 3 years before Yahoo even launched the Yahoo Answer service, right? And they also launched a blogging platform in 2003, which is a couple of years after they started in 1999. In 2004, they also entered to the webtoons markets that we've been talking about. And since then, they have been expanding to all forms of media, including audio content like podcast, audiobooks, music, video, and so forth. But now, having said that, in a recent interview, I was looking through some data and just some understanding of like this whole like UGC being the core of Naver. The CFO of Naver said that all product lines that Naver produced might look like a dissonant collage of different products, but for Naver, it was a very strategic play. And it's actually a continuum of its organic growth through the search engine, which basically the search engine is their core of it. But all these UGC contents that individual content creators create, it all like funnels back to their main business, right?
Yeah, totally. And I really started to research webtoons once we decided to make this podcast. And I mean, webtoons are so interesting. We have an entire episode dedicated to it. But I was it was very interesting for me to see that the CEO of the Webtoon Corporation, Junko Kim, he said that to him, Webtoons represented the company. Webtoon aspires to be like the Asian version of Disney,
Mm-hmm.
um, because well, this is what Naver claims. I haven't verified it, but they claim that they have the largest library of modern literature, you know, and they have 600,000 creators on their platform. And if a lot of when you think about the U.S. entertainment industry, a lot of this, the Marvel universe, DC, it's really based on comic books, from whether amateur or more professional comic book writers. Now we've got this kind of like UGC model on their platform, which they've been running for 20 years. They've just got like a whole library of things, and we already see the translation of just webtoons translating into like an actual top 10 Netflix show, which I think is pretty interesting. Now the question is, can they expand that to even other content types? Because I know writing typically translates to TV shows and movies, but maybe they develop a great IP. It starts off with a TV show, but then you can make a game off of it or something too. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, their playbook is kind of similar to US tech, which is, Google started off with search and now they got a bunch of stuff. Amazon started off with selling just books and now they got a bunch of other stuff. And I think once you have such a big business and scale, even if a small percentage of your users adopt a new product, that's a great win for them. It just keeps them. It's like a flywheel. Keeps them using your product. And I think that's really the story of Kakao as well. If you want to talk about them.
All right. It again very similarly to Naver. Kakao actually started as a small startup. They started way later compared to like Naver. It was founded in 2010, and it started with a messenger app called Kakao Talk. They still dominate the market. There's like 95% of the service usage time in Korea is like dominated by Kakao Talk. And this is like December 2021 numbers. And interestingly, this is not encompassing like all the foreigners using Kakao Talk. It's only like Korean nationals. So I think the number will be like higher by now. And after Kakao Talk became the dominant messaging app in Korea, they expanded to different business verticals as years passed by. And interestingly, 2014, Kakao decided to merge with Naver's direct competitor in the search and web portal segment called Daum. At one point, they were called Kakao, Daum Kakao, but it was like I guess it was like too long or everyone was like confused to it. So they decided to like rebrand themselves back to Kakao. And then in terms of like market cap, Kakao is ranked number 14 in Kospi, a little bit lower than Naver, but still, like, the growing quite aggressively. And so what I'm trying to say is like, Kakao is interesting because they started as the WhatsApp of Korea. And you know how like Meta acquired what's like it was like Meta kind of like coming and eating WhatsApp, but for the Kakao case, it started as WhatsApp and grew into like the Meta of Korea, right? Another analogy that we can use is like Kakao is basically China's WeChat model, where like WeChat started and then they start like expanding to all these like really big business verticals. I will say that Kakao's business can be divided into two segments. There is the platform portion and there's the content side. The platform bucket, we have Kakao Talk, again, the messaging app being at the core and the backbone of the entire ecosystem. And there's, again, the advertising and the commerce business to it. There's the fintech part, which is Kakao Pay, Kakao Bank. We're going to talk about it more in depth in the Naver versus Kakao episode. And then they do like venture out in emerging businesses. The mobility section is doing quite well. Enterprise, we need to see the numbers and what exactly constitutes the product lines. They decided to announce that they're going to do AI and healthcare recently. And so if you check the equity analyst reports from like last year, from like last quarter, like a lot of them have been like focused on the Kakao healthcare side of it. And then moving on to the second bucket, which is like the content side, we have Kakao Games that you'll be covering in the game episode. They act as both the developer and a publisher for the game segment. And the second branch is the core of what we want to talk about as well, where it's like the webtoons, the music, the media business. And in this segment, we have all the entities that fall under Kakao Entertainment. We have something called Piccoma, which is like the manga business of Kakao. We have SM Entertainment because now they're like a large shareholder of SM Entertainment. Melon, a very popular a local music streamer. And then we have the content IP production side for the OTT streaming services. So they do so much. And again, they started as just being the dominant messaging app, right? Yeah.
So, believe it or not, I think we're just scratching the surface of just these two companies, much less all the other companies we talked about. So, I think we're going to dedicate a whole episode, the next episode, to Naver and Kakao deep dives. Now, I did want to summarize a few big themes just from this episode and also kind of like a foreshadow into the future episodes. So, number one is the role of the Korean government. There's clearly good aspects and bad aspects, but it's interesting that the government's involved. Number two is just everything we talked about. It feels like there's intense competition in the Korean market. Like, we just take it for granted that because America is so competitive as well. But I think this is it's a feature, it's not a bug, and it should be acknowledged that there is a lot of capitalism and competition in Korea, despite Chaebols or whatnot. Number three, another big theme I've been hearing is that just given the context and size of the South Korean country, the ambitions of that country are greater than like the landmass. You can't say that about every other country. So that's why for a lot of these Korean companies, whether they're big or small or they're new, they have to like survive this intense competition domestically, and then their eyes are on like China or Japan, and it makes you really think about these bigger countries like China and Japan who they just have a huge market. And in some ways, they don't really innovate that much. Like we're here talking about the K Content podcast. When Japan and China are so much bigger, we're not really watching Chinese shows or Japanese shows. To some extent, Japanese anime is great, and there's a lot of that. But I think K Content is much bigger than Japanese anime when you look at hours watched on Netflix. So like, I think part of it is when you have a big market, you could make a decent profit, and maybe you don't need to innovate as much. And Koreans are like fighting tooth and nail to survive in their market just so they could get China, Japan, and then the US. And the last point, which I really see that's huge, it's a big thing for me, it's just like UGC, but from the webtoons and the writing angle. And, for people who work in the entertainment industry, writing really is the genesis of all this really content. Right. So it's fascinating to see this as a huge asset.
I mean, like to your third point, I think
Yeah.
ambitions are greater than the size of the country. If you again going back to South America, I lived in a lot of like South American countries that landmass are like way bigger than South Korea, and I think a lot of people don't realize that we're landlocked by our neighbors, the North Koreans, and we're a peninsula, right? So people think that just by all the exports that they're saying in terms of like cars, like electrodomestic goods, and like the content side of things, they think that Korea is huge in terms of landmass. But when they actually compare it in the map, it's like we're tiny, like we're maybe the size of two major cities of your country, right? But in terms of population, in terms of like what we're like all the signals that are coming out from the country, it's so big that people don't realize like, oh, okay, like compared to the actual geographical borders, Korea is like producing a lot. But as you said, like I think it goes back to like some historical context as well. Like the competition was so fierce because that was the only way we had, like that was like our only survival way, I think, right? The what we say about like the miracle of the Han River, it's a term that was coined just to explain like the exponential growth that we had after post-war Korea.
Right.
And one thing that we need to understand is like after post-war Korea and before that we gained like independence from the Japanese, like we were part of like the Japanese empire being a colony. But we were so poor that there were like at least like I think half of all the African countries were actually richer than South Korea back then. But if you think about it, like that's why we say like my great grandparents' generation and the life that I live in, the life that I had, our generation, is like comparing. We say that it's like comparing colonial times for an American
I
and
see.
like
I see.
modern day, right? It's so big, but it happens in such a like short period of time. That's why it's called the miracle of the Han River, because like I think my great grandparents would have never imagined that Korea would be like part of the top, even like top 30 like powerful countries, like in terms of like, economic size in the world. And it's amazing that all these competition and domestic competition has created this like great like companies and like content and all of that. But again, like there's also like the bad stuff of where like
Right.
high competition brings not the best outcomes.
Right. Right. Well, that wraps up episode 1. We got so much more to talk about in episode 2, which will cover Naver and Kakao. So we'll see you then.